There are moments in life that seem completely ordinary until, suddenly, they aren't. My father, a man named Raymond, has lived 62 years on this earth, and not once has he described himself as a hero. He's a mechanic, a guy who wakes up at 6 a.m., drinks bad coffee, and fixes other people's broken things. But in the spring of 2014, Raymond accidentally stumbled into the middle of a murder investigation, and what he did next changed everything. This is a true story, every word of it. Spring hits differently in a small town. The air gets warmer, the roads dry out, and for anyone running an auto shop that means one thing: slow business. People stop sliding into ditches. They stop skidding through intersections. The emergencies dry up along with the snow, and you spend a lot of time staring out the window, watching the world wake back up. Raymond's shop sat on a stretch of road that backed up against a steep hill. At the bottom of that hill ran a narrow creek and a jogging trail, the kind of place where dog walkers and joggers passed through in the early mornings and retired couples strolled in the evenings. Raymond had always liked that view. It was one of his small daily pleasures, standing at the edge of his property near the end of a shift, watching the water move and listening to the birds complain about nothing. It was a Tuesday afternoon in mid-April. The temperature hovered somewhere comfortable, not warm enough for short sleeves, not cold enough to bother you. Raymond was doing his usual end-of-day wind-down, walking along the side of the building, when something caught his eye halfway down the hill. A tarp, blue and crumpled, sitting in the grass like someone had dropped it on the way to somewhere else. Now, Raymond was particular about his property. He'd spent 20 years building his reputation in that town, and he was not the kind of man who let garbage pile up against his building. He started making his way down the slope, carefully, boots digging into the soft earth. He got within maybe 15 feet of the thing, close enough to see the way it was folded, the way it sagged in the middle, when he heard tires on gravel behind him. A customer had pulled in. Raymond turned around, went to work, and forgot about the tarp entirely. The next afternoon, 3 police officers walked into the shop. Raymond's co-worker, a quiet, steady man named Marcus, nudged him when they came through the door. Raymond set down his wrench and wiped his hands on a rag, reading the room immediately. Police didn't just stroll into auto shops to chat. Something had happened. Here's the thing about Raymond that you need to understand. The man could talk to anyone. It wasn't a skill he'd practiced. It was just who he was. He had one of those faces that made strangers trust him immediately. He asked the right questions, laughed at the right moments, and somehow made everyone around him feel like they were the most interesting person in the room. He'd used this gift his entire life, mostly for harmless things, but every now and then it came in useful in ways he hadn't expected. One of the officers, a woman named Detective Hargrove, started asking questions about the area behind the shop. Had anyone noticed anything unusual, seen anyone they didn't recognize, heard anything in the last 2 days? Raymond asked her what had happened. She hesitated. And in that hesitation, Raymond smiled. Warm, patient, the kind of smile that says, "You can trust me." And Detective Hargrove said that a body had been discovered at the bottom of the hill that morning. A jogger had found it around 10:30 a.m. Raymond's stomach dropped. "I was just down there yesterday," he said slowly. "I was going to clean up a tarp I saw on the hill. I got within 15 feet of it." The detective's entire posture changed. "What time?" she asked. "Did the tarp happen to be blue and white?" Raymond told her yes. He told her the exact time, where he had been standing, what direction the wind was blowing. She asked him questions for another 20 minutes. At the end of it, she confirmed what he had already begun to piece together. The body had been inside the tarp. Raymond had nearly grabbed it with his bare hands. A few days passed. The police came back, this time because they'd noticed the security cameras mounted along the shop's exterior. Standard setup, but positioned well, positioned in a way that might have captured something useful. While the data was being pulled from the system, Raymond started talking. He always started talking. He mentioned the neighbors, a couple living in a rundown shack connected to the bar behind his property. He'd had issues with them for years. Stolen scrap metal. Dogs running loose. Once, a man had threatened to shoot him over a garden hose. "You should look into them," Raymond told the officer. "I'm not saying they did it. I'm just saying they're the kind of people who don't shock you when something like this happens." The officer nodded politely and left with the hard drive. Raymond turned to Marcus. "Come on," he said. "Let's go see if there's anything else down there." Marcus looked at him the way Marcus always looked at him. Like he knew this was a bad idea, but also knew there was no stopping it. They went down the hill. The grass where the tarp had been was flat and matted, pressed down from days of foot traffic. The tarp itself was gone, taken into evidence. They walked along the creek for about 15 minutes, not finding much, when Raymond pushed a little further upstream. The trail eventually disappeared under a main road, resurfacing beside a man-made lake on the other side. Just under the bridge, where the water moved faster and the trees grew thick and tangled, Raymond spotted something wedged in the branches overhanging the stream. A shopping cart, red, a hardware store logo rusting along the side. Raymond's first thought, embarrassingly, was practical. That thing would be useful at the shop. He called Marcus over. They waded to the edge of the stream and pulled the cart free, water draining from the basket as they hauled it up the bank. Raymond grabbed the handle and socked. There was something on it. He leaned down. The rust he'd noticed wasn't rust. It was dark brown and dried, crusted into the gaps between the metal bars. He looked at the wheels. The same dark residue thickened in the crevices. And then he saw the other thing, pale and fine, stuck in the basket's wiring. "Marcus," he said quietly, "look at this." They stared at each other over the cart. "Is that—" "Yeah," Raymond said. "I think it is." He pulled out his phone and called Detective Hargrove. The department, to Raymond's genuine disbelief, was skeptical. He had to argue with two different people before they agreed to send anyone out. When the CSI unit arrived and started asking condescending questions, how did he know it was blood? How could he possibly know that was human hair? Raymond had to fight the urge to say something that would get him in trouble. The chemical test came back positive. It took the cart and left without so much as an apology. 2 weeks passed. The investigation appeared to have stalled, or at least moved into whatever invisible bureaucratic phase investigations move into when they leave the street and enter the system. Raymond went back to his routine. Oil changes, brake pads, the slow, comfortable rhythms of a business he'd spent his adult life building. Then one morning, he needed to make a supply run. There was a shortcut, a narrow dirt alley running behind the shop that connected to the main road. The neighbors had blocked it off more times than Raymond could count, parking one of their broken-down cars at the entrance like they owned the thing. But that morning, the alley was open. Raymond turned in, and then he slowed down. In front of the shack, a woman was on her hands and knees inside a car. The door hung wide open. Beside her on the ground were clustered bottles, bleach, heavy-duty cleaning solution, a container of OxyClean. She was scrubbing the passenger side floor with a stiff brush, her whole body moving with it, the kind of desperate, grinding effort that goes beyond cleaning. No water, no bucket, just chemicals straight onto the surface. It was the middle of the afternoon in June, hot, dry, and she was 2 blocks from a car wash. Raymond sat in his car and watched her for a long moment. Every instinct he had, and Raymond trusted his instincts completely, was screaming. He pulled out his phone and started recording. He'd known this woman for a few years. She and her partner had complained about his workers. He complained about their dogs. It had always been low-level friction, the kind that exists between neighbors who don't like each other but have to coexist. Nothing serious. Nothing that had ever made him think much about them beyond mild irritation. He thought about them now. He thought about Rich, the name the police had mentioned in passing, the name that belonged to the body in the tarp at the bottom of the hill. He thought about the Lowe's cart in the stream, covered in blood. He thought about the tarp he'd nearly grabbed with his bare hands. He thought about how close he had been to all of it. He drove slowly past her, phone still recording through the window. She didn't look up. This time, when he called Detective Hargrove, he didn't have to argue with anyone. The next morning, police arrived at the shack. The day after that, they made an arrest. What they found inside told the whole story. Beneath a rug in the back room, the plywood floor was soaked through with blood, so much of it that it had warped the wood. There was no explaining it away. When investigators confronted the woman, something inside her simply broke. She told them everything. There had been 3 people in the shack that night. Her partner, and the victim. A man named Rich, who had come over the way he often did. They were all using. And at some point, someone accused Rich of skimming, taking a little more than his share and pocketing it. Words turned heated. The argument escalated the way arguments do, when everyone involved is out of their mind, and there's nothing left to lose. Rich ended up on the floor, and he didn't get back up. The couple panicked. They didn't call anyone. They didn't turn themselves in. Instead, they did what desperate people do. They improvised. They found a shopping cart somewhere in the neighborhood and used it to move the body. They wrapped Rich in a blue tarp. They wheeled him through the dark to the edge of the hill behind the auto shop, and they pushed him down. They threw the cart in the creek, hoping the current would take it far enough that no one would find it. They went home and started cleaning. Raymond sat in his car with Marcus on the day of the arrest and watched it happen through the windshield. He had his phone out. The thing I keep turning over in my mind when I think about this story isn't the investigation. It isn't even how close my father came to picking up that tarp, though that image alone is enough to keep you up at night. It's the cart. Raymond found that cart because he was thinking about the shop, because he spotted something useful and went to grab it, because his mind works the way a practical man's mind works, always looking for what can be used, what can be fixed, what can be salvaged. He had no idea what he was actually pulling out of that water, and sometimes I wonder what would have happened if the current had carried it just a little further, if the trees hadn't caught it, if Raymond had taken the main road that day instead of the shortcut, if the customer hadn't arrived that Tuesday evening and he had grabbed the tarp himself. 1 or 2 degrees of difference in any direction, and the whole thing falls apart. The evidence disappears. A man named Rich becomes just another missing person with a complicated history and no one looking very hard for answers. But the current didn't take it far enough. Raymond took the shortcut. And a woman scrubbing a car floor in the June heat, surrounded by bleach, didn't notice the man watching her from the alley until it was already too late. The case was closed. But every time Raymond drives past that hill on his way into work, and he still does every single morning, he slows down just slightly, eyes drifting to where the creek bends under the road and the trees grow thick and dark. He's never quite explained why. He just says it feels right to pay attention, like something down there is still watching back. Some people say the most terrifying thing in the world is the unknown, a shadow in the dark, a sound with no explanation, a face you've never seen before, staring back at you from the tree line at night. But I've come to believe that's wrong. The most terrifying thing in the world isn't the unknown. It's the moment the unknown has a name. The moment it says, hello. My name is Jade, and this story is about my best friend Maya, a man named Darren, and the night our campsite burned to the ground while we were supposed to be sleeping in it. Maya and I had been friends since we were old enough to ride bikes to each other's houses, which in the middle of rural nowhere means since we were old enough to survive the heat and the bugs and the endless stretches of nothing between properties. She lived about a 10-minute walk from me, through the scrub and around the dry creek bed. Out here, that's practically next door. We were 14 that summer, reckless in the way only 14-year-olds can be, convinced that nothing genuinely bad could happen to us, that bad things were for the news, for strangers, for somewhere else. Maya had a lot of land behind her house. Old cattle country that her dad kept meaning to do something with. Wild grass, thick brush, a few eucalyptus that dropped bark like shed skin. It was ours in every way that mattered. We spent the days leading up to our camping trip clearing a path through the razor grass with an old cane knife we found in the shed. We wore shorts, which we immediately regretted. Our legs ended up cross-hatched with little red nicks. Our arms too, like we'd been dragged through barbed wire. But we didn't care. We were building something. A camp. A place of our own. We set up our hammocks in a clearing, maybe 200 meters from the house. Far enough to feel like an adventure. Close enough that Maya's dad could probably hear us if we yelled loud enough. We brought enough blankets to survive a snowstorm, which was honestly necessary. The nights out here drop hard and fast, even when the days are so hot you feel like you're melting into the dirt. By 9 o'clock, we were lying in our hammocks talking about nothing and everything the way teenage girls do, our voices low in the dark, the stars punching through the canopy overhead. The air smelled like dry earth and eucalyptus and the citronella candle we'd lit to keep the mozzies off. That's when we heard it. Movement. In the bush. Not subtle. Not the soft crackle of something small. This was deliberate. Heavy, Maya said immediately, but her voice was a little too quick, a little too certain. We both went still and listened. The sound kept coming, getting closer, resolving slowly into footsteps. Human footsteps. I sat up in my hammock and squinted into the dark. "Is that your brother?" I whispered. He'd done it before, crept up on us in the dark, waited until we let our guard down, then launched himself screaming out of the scrub. Classic. "Too tall," Maya murmured. We didn't move. We pulled our torches under our blankets so the light wouldn't give us away and watched the tree line. The figure was coming from the wrong direction entirely. Not from the house, from the other side. From the direction of the fence line that separated Maya's property from the newly leased land next door. He stepped into the clearing like he owned it. He introduced himself as Darren. He was somewhere in his 40s though, in the moonlight. It was hard to tell anything really except that he was swaying slightly where he stood. And the smell of alcohol arrived a full second before he did. His eyes were too bright and too slow at the same time, the way drunk eyes get when someone is further gone than they think they are. "Nice little camp you've got here," he said, looking around at our hammocks, our blankets, the flickering citronella candle. He smiled, and I felt something cold settle in my chest that had nothing to do with the temperature. We said thank you, or maybe we said nothing. I honestly can't remember. I think our bodies had already understood the situation faster than our brains had, and the instinct was, be small, be quiet, don't give him anything to grab onto. He kept talking. That's the thing about people like Darren. They fill space. He rambled and wandered and circled back on himself, and most of it blurs together now, but certain lines cut through the haze like something sharp. "I'll have to come out here and sunbathe," he said, looking at the hammocks with a smile that didn't belong on a face in the dark. "Get a bit of sun on me." Maya and I looked at each other. That wordless conversation that only close friends can have. He asked our age. When we told him, something shifted in his expression, not away from us, but toward us. "Nearly legal then," he said, almost to himself, and something in my stomach turned to ice. And then, with the kind of casual menace that probably haunts us both to this day, he laughed and said, "I'll have to do you girls, Wolf Creek style." He said it like it was a joke. Like it was funny, like we were all friends sharing a dark laugh out here in the bush. In between the things that made our skin crawl, he pulled out a glass pipe and offered us what he called a puff on the magic dragon. We declined. He didn't seem offended. He just kept swaying and talking, and Maya and I kept our faces neutral while, under the blankets, our fingers were flying across our phone screens. "Escape plan, now!" Maya was the one who said it, her voice impressively steady. She told Darren we were heading back to the house to get some food, that we'd probably be back later. He told us to come back, like it was an instruction. We left almost everything, the blankets, most of our gear, the candle. We walked fast without running, and we did not look behind us. And we did not stop until the back porch light of Maya's house was washing over us, and her dad was opening the fly screen door with a confused look on his face. We told him everything. We slept inside that night. The next morning, still half asleep and not entirely sure we hadn't dreamed the whole thing, Maya and I went back to the campsite. The hammocks were gone. The blankets were gone. The candle gone. In their place was a circle of scorched earth. Maybe 20 meters across, the grass burnt black and still smelling faintly of something chemical underneath the smoke. And from the edge of that circle, like a signature, a blackened line traced through the grass all the way to the fence line, all the way toward Darren's side of the property. I'm not a firefighter. I have no forensic training. But even at 14, even in the shock of standing there looking at the place where we'd been lying a few hours before, it was obvious. Fuel. Someone had used fuel. We didn't say it out loud for a while. We just stood there looking at the char. And then Maya said quietly, "He thought we were still in there." She didn't mean he thought we'd gone for a walk. She meant he thought we were in the hammocks. That the pile of blankets we'd left behind looked enough like two sleeping girls in the dark, that a drunk man with a glass pipe and a Wolf Creek joke in his back pocket had walked back across that fence line and done what he'd done. Maya's dad went next door. Darren wasn't home, or wasn't answering. His housemate came to the door instead, apologized without quite saying what for, and handed over $50 for the hammocks and blankets. No police were called. Not yet. Life tried to go back to normal. Months passed. Maya mentioned at school that her dad had installed cameras after spotting Darren lurking around the property line at dusk. I started going over to hers more often on the days her dad worked late because neither of us liked the idea of her being alone over there. One afternoon in particular, I was there when her dad wouldn't be home until evening. We were inside with the doors locked, which felt like enough. Which felt like the reasonable thing to do when the alternative felt unreasonable. When you're 15, you get very good at convincing yourself that locked doors are enough. The yelling started around 6 o'clock. Darren was drunk again. Or still, it was impossible to tell, and he was standing in front of Maya's house shouting about his dog. He was certain, absolutely certain, that Maya had stolen it. He was not quiet about this certainty. He stood in the street and announced it to anyone who might be listening in the dark of that rural road. Maya's dad called the police. They came. They took Darren away. The next morning, in the yard, not in the street, not near the gate, but inside the yard, we found a knife. It wasn't from Maya's house. Her dad knew every knife in that kitchen, and this wasn't one of them. The blade was long. It had been placed, not dropped. The police came back. They took the knife. They pulled the camera footage. Darren no longer lives next door. The property sat quiet after that. The way somewhere sits quiet after something has been removed from it. Here's the thing that stays with me, though. The thing I think about when I'm camping now, or hiking, or any time I'm somewhere with trees on all sides and dark coming in fast from every direction. The knife was inside the yard. Not thrown over the fence in anger. Not dropped in a struggle. Placed. Deliberately. Quietly. At some point between the night we heard him yelling and the morning we found it, Darren had been inside that fence. He had walked through Maya's yard in the dark, and the cameras that had caught him lurking at the property line before, had apparently missed him doing it, which means he knew where the cameras were, which means he had been watching long enough to learn. Maya moved away a few years ago. I understand completely. Every now and then, when something reminds us, we'll text each other messages that don't quite say what they mean. Something like, "Remember that summer?" And the other will reply, yeah, we remember. There's a particular kind of fear that doesn't make noise. It doesn't announce itself the way Darren did, swaying in a clearing, full of bravado and alcohol and whatever darkness lives in people like him. The quiet kind is worse. It waits. It watches. It learns your cameras before it decides to come inside. Wherever Darren ended up, I hope the doors between us are locked, and I hope he doesn't already know the layout. A frozen lake in winter that feels like the world holding its breath. The ice sits silent, thick, and still. And if you're lucky, that's all it ever does. But sometimes, something stirs beneath that silence. And sometimes, what stirs isn't beneath the ice at all. It's watching you from the tree line. My family has owned a cabin in the hills of upstate New Hampshire for over 3 decades, tucked along a small secluded lake shared by only a handful of other properties. It is without question my favorite place on earth. 6 cabins total. Most neighbors visit only in spring and fall, and even then, contact is rare. We coexist the way good people do in remote places. Quietly, respectfully, and with a general understanding that we look out for each other's property when the other isn't around. That arrangement has served us well for 30 years. We'd had a few minor break-ins over the decades. The occasional missing canoe, the sort of petty nonsense that happens anywhere. Nothing serious, nothing that ever made me think twice about going back. That changed this past winter. My wife Sarah and I had been running on fumes. Her new job was starting in a matter of weeks, and I had a pile of unused PTO that wasn't going to survive into the new year. So, on something of a whim, we packed up her father's F-150, loaded in our dog, a Boston Terrier named Biscuit, who operates under the firm delusion that he personally owns the planet, and hit the road for what was supposed to be a quiet week of wood stove fires, craft beer, winter hiking, and absolutely nothing productive. Before I tell you what happened, there are 2 things you need to understand about this place. First, it sits inside a complete cellular dead zone. You get maybe a bar or 2 at random intervals, never reliably. The nearest town with consistent signal is a solid 15 minutes by car, 10 minutes just to reach the edge of the dead zone, then 5 more into town. That disconnection is part of what I love about it. You can't be glued to your phone when your phone refuses to cooperate. Second, we were heading up in winter, which means the satellite phone service my family subscribes to, installed a couple years back after much debate, had been suspended for the season. My parents almost never go up in winter. We didn't think anything of going without it. We never had before. We were on the road before noon. The drive was easy. A couple of inches of old snow on the ground. Snowmobile tracks crisscrossing the back roads in every direction. Normal for that time of year. The lake gets popular in winter. Ice fishing, snowmobiling, people coming through the woods from trails that connect to neighboring towns. Lots of foot and sled traffic from people who have no connection to the properties on the lake. We've always accepted that as part of being there, part of why the neighbors look out for each other. As we crossed the causeway, a narrow land bridge that gives you a clear line of sight over both sides of the lake, I glanced out and spotted two men sitting at a picnic table that had been dragged out to the middle of the frozen lake. Fishing gear around them, beers in hand, normal enough, except for one detail. That was my neighbor David's picnic table. I recognized it immediately, because David, bless him, had painted it a very specific, very memorable shade of bright pink. It had sentimental value, apparently. Doesn't matter why. What matters is that a few years back, a group of fishermen had borrowed it without asking, left it on the ice, and it sank when the lake thawed. After that, David chained the replacement to a concrete footing at the edge of his property. So those two men had either broken the chain or broken the table to get it onto the lake. And David, for the record, lives in Florida, doesn't fish, hasn't visited in winter in years. I felt a flicker of irritation. Sarah agreed that it was obnoxious. I told myself I'd go say something. Maybe they just didn't know. I pressed the gas a little harder. As we came down the road toward the properties, the two men on the ice jumped up and moved fast, too fast, toward a pair of snowmobiles, parked directly in front of David's cabin. Before I even fully processed what I was seeing, they were on the sleds and moving. Two more men appeared from somewhere near the tree line, hopped on behind them, and all four roared off across the lake and disappeared into the woods on the far side. I stopped the truck. David's front door was wide open, lights on, smoke curling from the chimney. We sat there for a moment in total silence, watching the tree line where the snowmobiles had vanished. The sound of engines faded slowly, then was gone. Sarah said nothing. Biscuit wagged his tail at the window, unaware that anything was wrong. I pulled into our driveway, threw a quick start log in our wood stove just to take the edge off the cold, and we walked next door. The front door had been pried open. The wood around the frame was splintered outward, not forced in a moment of careless frustration, pried, deliberately, with a tool. Inside, the stove was roaring. Someone had stacked fresh wood beside it. The kitchen counter held paper plates, food wrappers, crushed beer cans, and a small mountain of cigarette butts. A cooler sat open near the couch. Two sleeping bags were unrolled on the living room floor next to it. These weren't people who had stopped for a few hours. They had moved in. I took pictures. Didn't touch anything. Smothered the fire in the stove so the cabin wouldn't keep burning wood unattended. Closed the damaged door as best I could with gloves on, and we drove into town to report it. The police were efficient and sympathetic. We reached David by phone. He was devastated, but grateful we'd caught it when we did. He was going to fly in from Florida as soon as he could arrange it, and asked if I'd nail a couple of boards across the door in the meantime. I told him of course. When we got back, two officers were already at David's place walking the scene. One of them came over to take my statement. I walked him through everything, ending with the part where I'd shut off the stove and pulled the door closed behind me. He looked at me for a moment before responding. "Are you sure you closed the door?" "Positive. It was standing open when we arrived. And the sleeping bags and cooler you described, they're not here. They had come back. While we were driving into town to report a break-in, they had turned around, come back to the cabin, grabbed their gear, and vanished again. They couldn't have known for certain that we hadn't immediately reached police. They took that risk anyway." The officer offered two possibilities. They had been watching us and returned the moment we left. Or there had been a fifth person somewhere nearby, someone we never saw, who had stayed behind to keep eyes on the property. I thought about the woods, about how I'd listened to those snowmobiles until the sound completely disappeared, about how the trees on the far side of the lake stretch for miles without a single structure. I hunt turkey out there every spring. I know those woods. I didn't argue the point. We nailed boards across David's door, dragged the pink picnic table off the ice. They'd cut the chain clean through, and went inside for what I can confirm was more than one beer. Sarah and I talked about going home. Seriously considered it. In the end, we decided to stay. We'd been looking forward to this week for months. We weren't going to let a group of idiots take it from us. And for a couple of days we were right. The cabin worked its magic. We slept in, watched DVDs, cooked real meals, drank too much, and let the stress drain out of us slowly. Every time a snowmobile passed somewhere in the distance, we exchanged a look, half nervous, half joking, and eventually the look became a game. Who could make the most dramatic face when they heard an engine? We laughed about it. We were fine. By midweek, we wanted fresh air, so we took Biscuit and hiked up to the old dam at the mouth of the stream that feeds the lake. Gorgeous day. Clear sky, clean snow, the frozen stream catching the light as it wound through the trees. 2 hours there and back at an easy pace. We were relaxed. Actually relaxed, for the first time all week. About 30 minutes from home, we heard snowmobiles. We made our faces. We laughed. Then we went quiet and listened. They were getting louder. The trail we were on was 5 or 6 feet wide, well traveled. When the sleds came into view ahead of us, about 100 feet up the path, I picked Biscuit up. He was already vibrating with the desire to introduce himself to these strangers at full volume, and we stepped to the side of the trail to let them pass. They stopped. Both of them just sat there on their idling machines, looking at us. I could see them talking to each other, then looking back at us. I raised a hand and waved. Neither of them waved back. After a few seconds, they revved the engines and came at us. Not at a pass-by speed, not at a cautious, sharing the trail speed, full throttle. Both of them, side by side, aimed directly at where we were standing. Sarah and I stepped back into the brush. The sleds went by so close that I felt the wind displacement off the nearest one. Inches. Actual inches. They stopped about 50 feet past us and turned to look back. I don't entirely know what made me do it. Adrenaline, probably. Fear wearing the costume of anger. I threw up my free arm, Biscuit snarling under the other one, and shouted something at them about what exactly their problem was. One of them raised a middle finger. The other revved his engine 3 times slowly, deliberately. Then they took off down the trail that leads directly to our cabin. We walked the last 30 minutes in near silence. Somewhere ahead of us, within earshot the entire way, the snowmobiles slowed to an idle. Not driving away, not going anywhere, just running, waiting. We stopped walking and stood still. The engines dropped to a low, circling rumble. Then after what felt like much longer than it probably was, they opened up again, full blast, and this time the sound got farther away, fading, gone. We waited until we heard nothing. When we came out of the trees into our yard, the snow around the cabin told the story clearly. Snowmobile tracks everywhere, around the front, around the back, looping circuits through the yard, around the perimeter of the property. They had been circling the cabin, while we stood frozen in the woods listening to them idle. They knew we weren't home. We packed in under 20 minutes, closed everything up, locked everything that locked, and left without discussing it much further. There wasn't a lot to say. We filed a second report with the police before leaving town. They were sympathetic, genuinely concerned given the context of the earlier break-in, and honest about the fact that there wasn't much they could do without more to go on. We gave descriptions. We gave our contact information. We drove home. The thing that doesn't leave me is this. When we were standing in those woods, listening to those engines idling somewhere just out of sight, we had no phone, no way to call anyone. We were 30 minutes from shelter and had no idea whether the people who'd been terrorizing the lake all week were at our cabin, inside it, or 30 feet away in the trees, watching us stand there. We never found out which one it was. Both families have since installed alarm systems, motion sensors, cellular alerts, the works. It's a reasonable response to an unreasonable situation, but an alarm tells you when something has already begun. It doesn't tell you how long someone was watching before they decided to move. And that's the part I keep coming back to. Not the break-in. Not the snowmobiles nearly clipping us on that trail. Not even the track circling our cabin like something measuring the distance before it closes in. What keeps me up at night is the officer's quiet, practical suggestion that there may have been someone else in those woods we never saw. Someone who stayed still while we walked past. Someone who waited. Because if that's true, they were there before we even knew to be afraid. And I have no way of knowing if they're still watching. We haven't been back since.